Hello again, good afternoon everyone. So we have discussed already different kinds of obligations. So mainly we have discussed pure and conditional obligations, and we have as well discussed obligations with a period. So as a continuation, on section 3, we will be discussing about alternative obligations, and to start with, let's have Article 1199. So to read the exact provisions of Article 1199, it says that a person alternatively bound by different prestations shall completely perform one of them. The creditor cannot be compelled to receive part of one and part of the other undertaking. So by this article, it's actually a definition, or we could really see of what is an alternative obligation. An obligation having different prestations. So basically, there are about 2 or more prestations. But before that, we have to recall about what is a prestation. So if we could recall, there are certain requisites or elements of an obligation. Kung tandaan nyo pa po, we have the active subject, we have the passive subject, and then we have the prestation, and then the juridical tie or the efficient cause, if we could recall. The prestation or the object, it is the promise, diba, or the particular contract to be observed in the performance of the obligation. It's either the giving of a thing, the doing of a thing, or not doing of a thing. Yun yung sinasabi nating prestations. And there are actually different kinds of obligations according to object. To classify, we have a simple and a compound obligation. When we say simple obligation, basically there is only one prestation. As an example, he has obliged himself to deliver a piano. So only one object to be delivered. The delivery of a piano or a repair of a car. Whereas a compound obligation is when there are 2 or more prestations, like an alternative nga na obligation. So it is further classified as conjunctive na obligation, na kung saan may several prestations or may several objects, kaso nga lang all of them are due. Whereas in a distributive na obligation, there are one of the 2 or more na prestations is due. So, hindi lahat compare with a conjunctive na obligation, na kung saan ang alternative under 1199 and the facultative under 1206 is part of a distributive na obligation. But they are classified as compound obligation as according to the number of objects or prestation. Question, ano ba talaga ang alternative obligation? So, na-discuss na natin kapag there are various prestations. So, basically, 2 or more prestations. But only one is due. Take note, 2 or more or various prestations ay due, pero only one could be said to be sufficient to extinguish the obligation. So, the delivery of one is sufficient for the extinguishment of the obligation. Yun po yung sinasabi diyan. So, ibig sabihin nito, there are several things that are due for delivery, but only one is sufficient to extinguish nga or to terminate the obligation. So, as an example, if I oblige myself to give you either object 1 or object 2 or object 3. Ako, on my end, I don't have to give you all of them, all of the 3 as stated, diba? Yung object 1, object 2, or object 3. The giving of 1, it could either be 1 or object 2 or object 3, is enough para makomply yung obligation. So, yun po yun. Here, ang tatandaan lang natin, sabi nga ng 1199, ang creditor naman, hindi din natin siya pwedeng pilitin na tumanggap lang ng one part lang ng one object and part of the other. So, ibig sabihin ito, one either of the three, ano. So, yun po yun. And let's continue. We have here an example to further understand the concept under 1199. Article 1200 or 1200. The right of choice belongs to the debtor unless it has been expressly granted to the creditor. And then the debtor shall have no right to choose those prestations which are impossible or which unlawful or which could not have been object of the obligation. Since madali lang naman intindihin ang provision na to, ang sinasabi lang diyan, kapag po sa alternative obligation, ang right to choose belongs to the debtor unless lang yun ay i-grant natin expressly to the creditor. Pero, even though he has the right to choose si debtor na mamili doon man kung saaling sa mga objects na subject or prestation, ay dapat hindi daw niya pipiliin yung impossible, hindi niya dapat pipiliin yung unlawful, or which could not have been the object of the obligation. So, yun ay para pong lumalabas dito na hindi nga siya po pwedeng pumili as a limitation on his right to choose ay yung impossible, unlawful, or which could not be an object which cannot have been the object of the obligation. So, as an example to this limitation, let's say, baga, I oblige myself to deliver to you a can of marijuana or a can of goat's milk taken from a carabao. Pwede ba yun? And a specific car, diba? So, out of those three options, so, since naman, these po pwede daw, according to this limitation, hindi po pwedeng imposible, hindi po pwedeng unlawful. Unlawful ang marijuana, imposible ang goat's milk. E di, ang po pwede lang ay ang, alin? Ay yung specific car. Take note ha. So, the right to choose belongs to the debtor. Let's say, for example, as an example, I oblige myself to give you object 1 and object 2. Hindi naman po nagme-mention nga kung alin doon. So, based on the provision, although it's silent, the right to choose or the right of choice belongs to the debtor. So, it is very important that you know the rules as being provided under 1200. The right of choice as a rule is given to the debtor. The right to choose the prestation belongs to the debtor, and by way of exception, it may be exercised by the creditor but only expressly granted by him. Alam na natin yan. Or by a third person. So, not just solely it could be granted yung right to choose to the creditor but also to third persons, provided na express siya ha, when the right is given to him by a common agreement. So, here, as an example, S binds himself to deliver item 1 or 2 to B on November 10 and to communicate his choice on or November 5. If S delays in making his selection, B cannot exercise the right because it is not expressly granted to him. So here, another example. D insured his house with R, an insurance company. It is agreed that if the house is destroyed or damaged, R may either pay the damage of the loss or reinstate or rebuild the house. Since nothing is said in the contract as who has the right of choice, it is basically with R as the debtor. So, yun po yun ang ating mga example. The right of choice of debtor is not absolute. May mga limitations. So, one of the limitations, as what I have mentioned under 1200, is that the debtor cannot choose for the prestations na impossible and unlawful and could not have been the object of the obligations, mga void yan. Hindi yan po pwede. Their presence do not invalidate the obligation. So, do not invalidate the obligation if it includes other undertakings otherwise free from such defects. Kaya in my previous examples, since ang remaining na lang ay yung specific car, then you have to deliver the specific car. So, in other words, under this provision, the debtor's right of choice is not extinguished altogether but limited only to the remaining na mga valid na prestations. The debtor has no more right of choice when among the prestations whereby he is alternatively bound, only one is practicable. So, parang nawawala na nga daw yung kanyang right to choice kapag only one na lang naman ang practicable. And then, in this case, there is not only a limitation but a loss of the right of choice belonging to the debtor. And the obligation becomes simple and pure. Simple na obligation. The debtor cannot choose part of one prestation and part of another prestation. So, ito yung mga sinasabi nating mga limitations under the provisions of 1200.